Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar focused on regulatory aspects of health tech development. So this webinar is hosted by the NIHR HealthTech Research Centre in Emergency and Acute Care in collaboration with the NIHR Manchester Biomedical Research Centre. So I'm Annie Yarwood and I'm the Operations Manager for the NIHR HealthTech Research Centre in Emergency and Acute Care. There we go. Okay, so I will start today by giving a brief overview of our HRC and how we can support companies to generate evidence for their technologies. I'll then hand over to Richard Hall to take us through device classification, the regulations and legislation. And then we'll have time for a few questions at the end of the first section, followed by a short break at 2:20. We'll then reconvene at 2:30 where Richard will discuss technology readiness and quality management systems, and we'll have a brief Q&A before we close. Okay, so I'll give a quick overview of our HRC. So our Health Tech Research Centre in Emergency and Acute Care is based in Manchester. In April 2024, the NIHR designated 14 new health tech research centres, or HRCs, across England. So HRCs are centres of excellence that support health tech development and evidence generation to enable regulatory approval and implementation of innovation into healthcare. And each of the 14 HRCs has its own speciality focus area. So our HRC is focused on emergency and acute care and is led by Professor Tim Felton, who is a consultant in critical care and respiratory medicine. Emergency and acute care in the NHS is under enormous pressure, with approximately 60,000 people accessing these services every day in England. And health tech has the potential to revolutionise healthcare delivery in this area. So our vision is to transform emergency care by driving the commercial development of health technologies that will inform clinical decision-making, improve diagnosis and optimise treatments, getting patients the right care in the right place at the right time. So we aim to achieve this through co-development of health tech through collaboration across stakeholders, bridging the gap between care settings, supporting our patients by bringing new innovation to market, supporting industry and innovators by providing an infrastructure that will allow rapid development of technology with high quality evidence, and increasing capacity and capability in the sector through training and development. So the HRC is comprised of 4 themes, which are split into 2 clusters. So we have a clinical cluster, which focuses on patient care pathways and clinical delivery settings. And this includes our theme 1, which spans community, primary and ambulatory care, as well as including A&E as the interface between primary and secondary care. And this focuses on technologies that could ease pressure on services, for example, preventing people presenting at A&E, diagnosing people earlier, or allowing them to receive the right treatments or care sooner. Theme 2 is focused on acute care in secondary care, looking at quicker, better diagnosis in a hospital setting, and builds on our expertise in acute cardiology, respiratory medicine, critical care, infectious disease, and pharmacogenomics. We have then a methodology cluster, which determines the needs and barriers which may be encountered within urgent care, which need to be understood and addressed in order to achieve successful development and deployment of new technology. So theme 3 looks at understanding the problem, so understanding the population that the technology might benefit. What does the current care pathway look like? And the scale of the challenge in terms of health and the economy that the technology aims to address, and how the health tech could change that. Theme 4 looks at evaluation, so designing and conducting clinical validation and clinical utility studies, health economic analysis, implementation science and behaviour change methodologies to really ensure that technology has all the evidence required for market access. So in reality, all of these themes work together synergistically across our projects. So within our centre, we have expertise in the following areas, which enables us to generate robust evidence for novel health technologies, ultimately providing proof that the technology delivers the intended health benefits, it's cost effective and can be safely integrated into the health and care system, ensuring meaningful impact on public health. So evidence generation is essential for regulatory approval, but it also builds credibility and stakeholder confidence, which ultimately facilitates adoption and uptake. So as a HRC, everything that we do is underpinned by our strategies around capacity building, patient-public involvement and engagement, or PPIE, equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI, and sustainability. So I mentioned earlier that we want to increase capacity and capability in the sector through training, but also through things like secondments with industry partners and studentships. We aim for PPIE to be included in all of our projects to ensure that HealthTech, which we co-develop, is beneficial for everyone. We're also focused on EDI in terms of the workforce, but also looking at inclusive research methods. So looking at inclusion in commercial clinical trials, for example. And we also want to highlight sustainability and the NHS net zero targets and how this might impact HealthTech developers, but also look at care pathways and quantifying carbon savings that could be offered by novel health technologies. So how can the HRC support industry and innovators? Typically, industry or innovators come to the NHS usually to a specific clinician that they've identified in their area of interest, and the clinician then tries to get some traction around the technology, tries to find people to support them to move this forward. They then need to apply for funding to support the project, but this can be difficult as they don't always know the right people and they don't have the time and the capacity to do this. So the HRC can support this project, this process, because we have a team of project managers who can work with clinicians and industry partners to assess the technologies, determine the support that's needed, and the HRC team can then utilise our pool of expertise to bring together the right group of experts to begin to design a study, to write a grant to fund the project, develop protocols and progress the project through to delivery, providing a more streamlined process and supporting companies to navigate the complex NHS system. So to support this process, we developed a programme of work called Validate, which is a master protocol with overarching ethical approval. So this study is device and disease agnostic. So when we want to conduct a study with a new technology, we can do this under the Validate umbrella, adding the study as a sub-protocol. So this means we don't have to go through lengthy ethics applications each time we want to test a new device. So this platform was designed specifically to support commercial partners where speed and agility is key, and the study currently covers feasibility and diagnostic accuracy studies. So how can you get access to our support? If you contact us via our inquiry form on our website or via our email address that we've shared, the first step is to meet with our core team to discuss the technology and where you're up to in terms of development and evidence generation and what you're looking for from us. So we'll then review the technology at our prioritisation panel, which consists of clinical and methodological experts. We'll provide advice on what we think the next steps are for you. And if you then want to work with us, we can start to build a project team, bringing together the right people. We can then begin to develop the study and protocols, write grants, and apply for necessary ethical approvals. So most of the studies that we conduct with industry partners are funded by external grant applications, for example, from NIHR or Innovate UK, where we are a collaborator on the grant with the industry partner, and we can support innovators to write grant applications. So once a study is approved and funded, we then provide project management to oversee the study delivery in the relevant departments. So I should also mention that we are based within Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, or MFT, which is the largest NHS trust in the UK, serving a population of about 1 million people. And we have 10 hospitals across 7 principal sites. So we're also part of a wider innovation ecosystem, which includes several other pieces of infrastructure which span the innovation pipeline. So not all of them are listed on here, but some of them that might be of interest include the NIHR Manchester Biomedical Research Centre, which is part of MFT and the University of Manchester, which aims to translate scientific breakthroughs into new treatments, diagnostics and medical technologies. So those innovations can then be pulled through into infrastructure such as the HRC. So within the HRC, we sit between technology readiness levels 3 to 7. So a technology has usually demonstrated proof of concept or analytical validation, and then we work with the company to generate further evidence all the way through to pilot integration. We can then feed those technologies through to MFT's Innovation Technology Adoption Programme, or ITAP, which is designed for fully developed technologies. So ITAP then provides a streamlined, structured approach to adoption across MFT, accelerating decision making and providing a blueprint for wider adoption nationally, which can then be used by the health innovation networks. So if you are interested in any of these other parts of infrastructure, then please contact us and we can direct you to the right place. So this is our core team. So if you're a company or a clinician or an academic working with a commercial partner and you would like to support from us, then please contact us via our email or through our inquiry form on our website. Okay. So that just leaves me to hand over to Richard now. So Richard has worked in the medical device industry for many years. He runs a regulatory consultancy business called QMS Consultancy and has supported, I've got over 80 companies, Richard, but it might be more than that now, to develop medical products. Richard is also a trained auditor and a lecturer in medical device regulations. So please do add your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and Richard's slides are numbered, so if you have a question specifically related to a specific slide, then please refer to that in the Q&A. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Annie?
I can, yeah.
Okay, and if I share slides, can you see? Okay. Can you see my presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thanks everybody for attending this presentation. It's a really long presentation. It's all about regulations, so I will try and make it as cheery as possible. There is a break in the middle to go and make yourself a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back together and hopefully answer some of the questions that we didn't tackle in the first part. The first slide has got my business card on it because I do encourage you to contact me. I hold a regulatory clinic every Wednesday, and I speak to 4 to 6 people every Wednesday when I'm not doing things like this, so that I can answer regulatory questions. All verbal communication is free of charge, and you can have as many calls as you need. What I'm trying to do is get as many medical devices to the market as I can do in my lifetime. So feel free to contact me anytime. A little bit about myself. Annie did a good introduction then. I've been working in the medical device industry now for 30 years. The first 20 years in industry, where I was QA and design manager for the last 5 years. Part of that work was running the mechanical design for part of the product, which I reinvented so that it would function better, it would be easy for our suppliers to manufacture, and therefore it would have less quality issues. So design for manufacture is really important to me. I started my consultancy 10 years ago now, and I've helped over 90 companies now with more than 140 products. It's a mix of class 1 to class 3, class A to class D IVDs, software as a medical device, custom-made devices, and some things called LDTs, which I'll introduce in a little bit. I've now passed 89 notified body audits with my quality management system. So it's fully validated, and that's 89 out of 89, not 89 out of 200. And I donate a lot of time back to the industry. So as Annie said, I'm an honorary practice fellow at Imperial College London, where I lecture once or twice a year, and then I'm an expert resident in Oxford, and I donate every Wednesday. I'm also active in a number of accelerators. So some of you may have seen some of these slides before, because I try and educate as much as I can do, but please forgive me if you see something you recognize. So the first thing to do is to understand the whole regulatory environment. So you need to understand the whole picture to understand how the regulations impact your particular product. And in order to understand, you have to see the full picture. And you might have seen that old is it an Ethos fable or something, where there was 6 wise men given part of an elephant, and they had to describe what the elephant looked like. And some of them said it looked like a snake because they were around the tail, and some said it was like a tree because they were at the leg. And none of them could describe the whole animal because they didn't see the whole thing. In order to understand medical devices, we have to first understand what the regulations are trying to do and to try to tell us. We need to implement design control for our projects. And in order for that to happen, we need a quality management system. It's the intersection of all of these 3 parts, which is where we want to build our medical devices. If we do it correctly, it makes the journey a lot safer, a lot quicker, and you make a better product. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the regulations. So what is a medical device? Who are the regulators? What is the legislation? And I'll talk about a thing called scope. And then from there, we'll look at risk classification. How do you determine the risk classification of your device? I'll go on, we'll have a break, and then I'll talk about design control aspects of the projects. So what is 13485? Why is it important? What does it do in terms of creating an ethos for design development? And what do the FDA think about 13485? I'll talk about what is the typical structure and contents of a technical file, and I will give you a roadmap for developing a medical device. I've just noticed that my TRL model is different from NIHR, so we can all have a debate about that. But in general sense, what we need to do with TRLs is have a framework to work within. And then once we've got that, we know where we are on the journey, we know what we've done, and we know what we need to do next. So it doesn't really matter, but the general ethos is generally the same. And then what can we do right now in your daily lives in order to maintain regulatory compliance and make sure that you're regulatory compliant in the future? So we'll start then looking at the medical devices. So is your product a medical device? Well, to answer that fundamental question, we need to first go back to the definition of what a medical device is. And for me, the best definition really is in the European Medical Device Regulation. On the left-hand side of these slides, you'll see references to important information like the regulations, and the regulation number is 2017745, and that's something you can download now and start reading and interacting with. Article 2 in the regulation says that a medical device is any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following medical purposes. So first of all, if you can use your device in veterinary or agriculture, then maybe you can skip a lot of the regulations around medical devices, gain some information, some feedback, and then go into the medical industry at a later date. I've had a couple of clients that have done that in the past. Just I forgot to mention before, the reason we were using the European regulation for this talk is because the UK is using the old directive, and the old directive is not as deep and meaningful as the regulation, and it is assumed that the UK will follow, and eventually we have our new UK MDR, the MDR will follow the European MDR. So is the product for human beings doing one or more of the following purposes? So is it doing diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of a disease, or diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of a compensation for an injury or disability? These 2 lines cover the majority of medical devices. On the right-hand side, we've got whether the device is not a medical device, or underneath whether it is a medical device. This is a facility in Sheffield where, excuse me, each one of these black dots on the wall is a camera, and they can analyze movement within the room. It's quite a large room. You could play sport in the room, and they can analyze the movement and work out whether or not you've invented the best trainer in the world. And that would not be a medical device, because sport and becoming better at something is not part of the definition. However, they could use exactly the same technology for analyzing the gait of somebody, either who has Parkinson's disease or is progressing through, or perhaps even diagnosis of Parkinson's, or monitoring the patient after knee surgery. So how someone moves would be a good way of monitoring their recovery. And you could see monitoring of an injury or diagnosis monitoring of a disease. Because we're fitting the definition, it means we're very likely to be a medical device. So if you're thinking, am I a medical device or is my technology medical device, then does it match the definition? Keep going back to that. Here we've got an example of how things can be different in different parts of the world. So the top one, if we said that we're putting something on the market to do muscle stimulation to make stronger humans, we could have a tagline, strengthen the core and prevent back pain. If we have that tagline, it would not be a medical device in the UK or in Europe, because preventing pain is not part of the definition. Preventing diseases, but you have to treat or alleviate an injury and therefore pain. So at the bottom, we've got relieve back pain, and then you are then preventing, you are trying, if you relieve back pain, you are treating an injury. So you do fit. Now, this is the European definition. So in the UK and Europe, the definition is roughly the same, and it means that it's not a medical device in the top box and it is in the bottom box. However, the US, you'll see a green tick. The US consider this technology to be a medical device or needs to be regulated under the medical device regulations because it changes the physiology of the body. So they see a difference between the UK and Europe and America, and different parts of the world see things differently. So you always need to check the local environment for the regulations before you can say categorically it is or is not a medical device. What the device does has a big impact on the classification of a medical device as well. So here we've got a watch, and the watch is in the top box. It's measuring heart rate, and heart rate can be used for fitness reasons. You could use it in a medical application, but it's not generally accepted as a medical device if it just has a heart rate monitor. However, in the bottom box, it's got an ECG fitted to exactly the same result, exactly the same device. So dependent on what the device does can influence whether it's a medical device or not. Apple brought out the watch originally with ECG and said it wasn't a medical device. And then in 2018, Series 4 was declared to be a medical device. But that's because they had enough evidence then to show efficacy of it. They got FDA approval and a European approval, CE mark. The next line of the definition is about investigation, replacement, or modification of the anatomy or of a physical pathological process or state. So here we've got a spare leg that I found on the internet, and I know it's a medical device because it's got a CE mark on it, and I know that it's a class 1 medical device because there's no number associated with this. Even if this leg was used in a sporting environment, it would still be a medical device because the intended use, the primary intended use for this leg is as a prosthetic because somebody doesn't have a leg. So they've got a prosthetic because they've got a medical condition, and that's the primary use of the device. The next line talks about providing information by means of in vitro examination of specimens derived from the human body, including organ, blood, and tissue donations. So here we've got IVDs, which take a sample of a bodily fluid or a cell and then translate that into a diagnostic property of the patient. We've got something similar happening in laboratories up and down the country, and where you can use standard equipment like a pH meter or MRI or something, and you can, not MRI, what am I thinking of? Anyway, balances, pipettes, or those sorts of things, you can come up with a diagnostic indication for a patient using standard laboratory equipment. And up to now, that's been seen as a loophole, if you like, within the industry. But the latest version of the regulation in Europe, the IVD regulation 2017746, includes Article 6 for distance sales. And although when you read Article 6, it won't actually make any sense, what it means when you interpret it is the fact that if you were to analyze cells for a patient who is European in a laboratory, your laboratory processes need to be CE marked against the regulation. And that can happen in Europe, but it can also happen in the UK. So someone in the UK could create a lab to analyze cells. They could be sent some blood from France, and a French patient is analyzed, and that lab in the UK needs a CE mark in order to operate successfully. The Americans were going to follow LDT, laboratory developed test, as a thing, but under the latest Trump administration, that's been canned, and they're going to go back to just standard labs now. The UK is also considering LDTs under its new UK MDR that should be launched next year. The next line talks about which does not achieve its principal intended action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. So in other words, the medical device is not a drug. The medical device can be assisted by a drug, but in order to be considered a medical device, its primary function has to be medical device, and in order to be a drug, its primary or principal function has to be as a drug. In the tube, we've got nanoparticles, a theoretical product of mine, basically, that you would rub on the skin, and the nanoparticles would take a drug into the body. The drug would be a medicinal product, the nanoparticles are a medical device, and the tube is an accessory to the medical device. The tube has its own regulatory framework, but it's the nanoparticles which are the medical device in that situation. The more typical example would be a syringe full of medicine, where medicine's inside and you've got the syringe, which is a medical device. The next couple of lines talk about the following products shall also be deemed to be medical devices. So devices for the control of or support of conception, or products specifically intended for the cleaning or disinfection or sterilization of devices. So if you create a biocide in a laboratory and sell it, if you sell it for general use, it's a bleach, or it's a general biocide. If you sell it specifically for use on a medical device, then the biocide itself becomes a medical device under the regulation. So a disinfectant wipe for a stethoscope is the disinfectants within the wipes, they become medical devices. And then we get on to software. So in the top of the definition it includes software as a thing that could be a medical device. Now, when you read the regulation, you would be forgiven for thinking that any software used in a medical context is medical device, because any medical device could be providing information which is used to take decisions with clinical decisions for diagnosis or monitoring purposes. That's one of the definitions of a medical device within the regulation. Now, the MDCG organization has written a very good document. It's 2019-11, and again, you can download this from the internet, and it explains specifically what is and what's not medical device, and what software, and what is medical device or IVD software. And it's a very easy document to read, but what it overwhelmingly says is that in order for software to be a medical device, it has to process, analyze, create, or modify medical information, and that medical information must be governed by a medical intended purpose. So the medical intended purpose is something that matches the definition. So if you're doing something to do with the definition and you are processing data, then you're very much likely to be a medical device. But there is some nuance to this. So in the top box, which is not medical device, we've got a device sending information about the patient up to the cloud. The cloud has an algorithm in it which creates a graph, and the graph is a better representation. You might call it embellishment or an improvement in the cosmetic or compatibility of the data. That information is then sent to the clinician. The clinician takes action, and that affects the care pathway of the patient. And none of what I've just described is in fact medical device software. It only becomes medical device software when you process, analyze, create, or modify that information. So if you have, as part of the algorithm, a barrier that if you cross a certain barrier, it changes the color of the graph, or there's some flag or some alarm, then you're processing that individual's data, and therefore it becomes a medical device. And would need to be classified under the regulations. But before you do that, if you store, transmit, send, or cosmetically improve data, that's not medical device. It's not a medical device software. This is an example of one of my clients. So they created a piece of software that sat on a phone. The phone would be used in places in India and other third world countries initially. And the idea was that babies would be taken into a clinic, and the clinic would use existing medical devices like electronic stethoscopes and thermometers and blood oxygen meters to measure the condition of the child. And then all of that information would normally be sent randomly on an email, perhaps, to the clinician. But the clever little app would have a way of displaying it all in one place, so the clinician got a bundle of information that they could act on very quickly. Now, the clinician during this operation has no sight of the patient, has no relationship with the patient, and makes a life or death decision quite often on the next steps for the patient. So if the patient has breathing difficulty, then they should be sent home, or because they've got a cold, or sent straight to A&E. What my client then did was they added a score. So there's a little algorithm that had a lookup table. They didn't invent the standardized health score. That was already in place in the NHS. What they did was included it within their app so that the standardized health score could be used as a lookup table to produce a number. And then the higher the number, the more ill the patient is. So it's a way of condensing like 6 or 7 different bits of information into one score. And although it's not a very big step forwards, it suddenly turned it into a medical device. So a real life example. The MHRA have been busy doing new things, and one of the things they said they would do is they would release information and guidance on what they call a digital mental health technology, a DMHT. They did that on time this year to their scale, to their timescale. And there is a document you can download about it. It's quite a long document. There's lots and lots of examples in it, but essentially what it says is on the screen here. So a DMHT is a digital or software product supporting mental health or well-being. They are commonly referred to as software as a medical device, SAMD, and they can range from apps to VR-based interventions. So anywhere you've got an electronic device that's doing something with mental health, there's a new layer of regulation on top of it now, as long as it's sold in the UK, because it's the MHRA that have come up with this new nuance. In order to consider whether your technology is DMHT, there's lots of acronyms in this business. You need to determine, first of all, whether the device is a medical device, and also consider the functionality of the device. So first of all, is it a medical device? Does it have a medical device purpose? So what is the clinical problem or unmet need that DMHT helps with? What is the medical purpose or claim? What is the targeted clinical symptom or condition? Who is it intended for? At what point in the healthcare pathway is the product intended to be used? And does the DMHT have any contraindications? And what are the potential harms associated with the DMHT? All those things need to be considered, and then we need to look at complexity. Excuse me. Does the DMHT have sufficient functionality in order to be classified? So if you've got some form of electronic diary that someone with depression or anxiety could keep, you could create that very easily on a mobile app. Someone could download it. It could even communicate to the internet. It could communicate to their doctor. It could communicate to a friend or family member who lives close by, that if you're recording things which indicate you've got anxiety or depression and it's getting worse, they can pop around and have a look and make sure you're okay. That I've just described would not be considered a medical device. It's like an electronic diary. It's just storing, transmitting information. Any data processing done on that app for the individual, as long as it's a very easily verifiable calculation, like if they say the scale is 1 to 3, and every day they say how depressed I feel, it's a 1, very depressed, 3, very happy, and 2 in the middle. And if they go through their week like that, and they're saying, oh, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, then they can show an improvement possibly in their anxiety. And the calculation is really easy to understand because it's just a multiplication of the numbers 1 to 3 for the number of days in the week. So it's very easy to understand and work backwards. So that's seen by the MHRA as not a medical device, although I've just told you that if you process data, it becomes a medical device. So there's a slight divergence there, as far as I can understand from the text, between the MHRA and what the Europeans are considering is software as a medical device. However, what they both agree on, and unless my interpretation is incorrect, is if the device processes user instructions with an interactive or personalized output, or processes data or information with a calculation algorithm and is not easily verifiable. I've underlined easily, but not, and processes data information with using AI, then you would consider that as DMHT. Okay. So what do you do with that information? So we need to look at classification if it is a medical device and if it is a DMHT or general medical device software. So what I've covered so far is it a medical device, and how would you determine that? Moving on to the regulators. So everywhere you go in the world, there will be a regulatory body whose job it is to prevent you from placing your product on the market until you've satisfied to them that it is safe and effective. In general terms, people sell in Europe and America because that's roughly equates to about 60% of all medical device sales. The UK represents around about 7%, and most of that goes to the NHS. So although it's a small percentage, if you tap into the NHS, then it's an easy sell because you're straight into the NHS, although there are individual trusts, that makes it more complicated. So let's start with UK and Europe. So for CE marking, we need to understand that there are competent authorities. So every region of the world has its own competent authority. And in Europe, there are 27 competent authorities because there's 27 countries in Europe after Brexit. The job of the competent authority in Europe is to assess the notified bodies. Now, nowhere else in the world, apart from the UK, has notified bodies. They all just have competent authorities. But in the UK and Europe, we've got these notified bodies. They are audited by the competent authorities, and their job is to audit industry. Not all of them can do all the same things. So some of them will audit medical device companies, some will audit IVD companies. There's 50 that do medical devices and 17 for IVDs. And you can click on this link when it gets shared as a PDF later. You'll be able to click on that link and look for the full list. If the link takes you to a list of regulations, and you need to find the correct regulation, and then you'll see all the different notified bodies. Now, the thing is, I wouldn't go directly to that website. I would start by looking under the MHRA. So the MHRA is the UK competent authority, and the UK has designated 9 UK approved bodies to act as notified bodies in the UK. Some of them you'll have heard of, some of them you won't, and not all of them will be suitable. So if you're developing an IVD and you want to sell it in the UK only, then you can use all 9. If you're selling a medical device, you can't use UL because, to my best of my knowledge, they don't interact with medical device companies, and you can't use LNE GMED because they're not intended to go to Europe, as far as I know. So the list is only 7, and so you need to choose one of your 7 notified bodies and make sure that they have a European office. Those that do mean that you can then in the future get a UKCA mark and a CE mark. If you choose unwisely, you'll only be able to get a C mark. Now, a CE mark might be exactly what you do need, and some of that will come down to classification, and we'll come on to classification shortly. So in terms of legislation, there are 3 bodies of legislation that I can point you towards. There is regulations, standards, and guidance documents. First of all, if we look at regulations, every country has its own regulation. Within Europe, it's a set of countries that have the European regulations. In terms of what most people need to meet the requirements of, I would start by looking in the UK against the UK MDR 2002. This is a document that was written in 2002, hence the name. But at the time, we were part of Europe, and what it says, over 100 pages, it says, use the European directives. Now, when Brexit happened, that happened in January, and the same year, the European regulation came out. And what that's led to is that means that the UK is following the Medical Device Directive and the IVD Directive until they publish the new UK MDR, presumably UK MDR 2026, because that's what the MHRA website are saying about when it will be released. In Europe, we've got two regulations, one for medical devices, one for IVDs. And then in America, there are lots of regulations, and they stem from CFR 800-ish to CFR 1200-ish. And there's not 400 regulations, but they fall in those brackets. Everywhere you look, they're all trying to ensure the product is safe and effective. So everybody's trying to do the same thing. So this is my favorite slide of my slide deck. This is actually my son, Oliver. So Oliver had a 18-inch steel bar implanted into his chest for 2 years. Now that was in between his lungs and his rib cage. And it's one of the reasons I'm speaking to you today, because I want to give back, basically. I was really pleased, because I know about CE marking, to see the CE mark on that medical device when it came out. Yes, we did keep it. The manufacturer of that medical device will need to meet the requirements of 5 ISO standards. So usability engineering, risk management, labeling, and there's 2 for labeling that everybody needs to meet the requirements of, and quality management systems. You would also need to ensure that they met the requirements for biocompatibility and sterility. And if they hadn't done that, then my son would probably not be here today. The X-ray that took the picture has to meet the requirements of all the blue ISO standards, same as, but also there are other ISO standards which they need to meet the requirements of for electrical safety and ionizing radiation, etc. So the message here is that you need to identify the ISO standards which comply or are integrated with your technology. So within all of the regulations say that your product must be state of the art. Now, state of the art means that it must meet the relevant ISO standards. And so we see the 5 ISO standards that were on the previous slide apply to everything. There might be other ones as well, but these are the 5 that I can think of. And then there are ISO standards that apply to a lot of medical devices. So if your product has got software in, then the IEC 62304 software standard is extremely important. If your electronic device connects to the internet, then the ISO IEC 27001 for cybersecurity is important. If your medical device touches the patient, then 10993 for biocompatibility is important, etc. You'll see that there is one for electrical safety of medical devices, 60601-1. What we need to understand is that there are lots of nuanced standards as well that apply to very specific applications. And for 60601, there's probably 70 different ISO standards which are related to ISO 60601 and talk about electrical safety for specific applications. So how is anyone expected to understand all of this and work the way around? Well, you can locate the correct standards using Google, Wikipedia. You can use a function called BSI Shop. If you Google BSI Shop, it'll take you to the BSI website to a certain page where they've done a brilliant job in showing you what is the most up-to-date standard. And then there's another button saying, well, please buy the standard, but they are expensive and maybe £300 per standard. If you went to evs.ee, it's an Estonian website where you can buy the same standard for about £30. So there is really no excuse when you know where to look for these standards. Universities quite often have these in libraries as well, so you can tap into that if you're a member of the university. On the left of the page, we've got a document which is very imaginatively called the Commission Implementing Decision 2020-437 of March 2020 on the harmonised standards for medical devices drafted in support of the Council Directive. And then there's one for 9342 EEC and there's one for 9879. One is the Medical Device Regulation Directive and one is the IVD Directive. I think it's a complete list of ISO standards. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a good place to start. So if you're looking to work out what standards apply to you, it's all on one page. You can just go through it. I would use it with a grain of salt because it's out of date, because it was written in 2020. So if you look at 1041-2008 and you use the BSI shop to look it up, you'll see that 1041 was written in 2008, it was updated in 2013, and it's currently withdrawn, and it's been superseded by 20417, and that was superseded in 2021. All the standards have approximately a 10-year shelf life to them, so it's important to keep up to date with these things. Then we get onto the guidance documents. So the guidance documentation is exactly what it says on the tin. There's been guidance documents produced to help explain what the directives are talking about for about 30 years. There's approximately 30 of them. I'm not sure exactly where the full list would be. One of them is very important. It's the MedDev 2.7/1 revision 4, and it was issued in 2015 to explain what is required for a clinical evaluation. Now, IVD companies don't need a clinical evaluation, but all medical device companies do, including most software companies. In the UK, I believe it is not required for a class 1 device, but it is required for all classification in Europe. So there's this slight nuances. The idea is that it aligns the requirements for Europe with the new regulation, and it was brought out in 2015 as the new regulation was coming into force. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think it's needed for a class 1, but somebody might be able to inform me on that if I'm incorrect. There is MDCG guidance documents. When I say class 1, I meant in the UK. MDCG guidance documents are there to support the requirements of the regulation and explain what the regulations in Europe are talking about. I've mentioned one already, which is the guidance document for software 2019-11, and it is brilliant. So if that's a good example of everyone, you'll find what you need to know if you do a search. There's more than 120 of these have been issued already, and there's another 30 plus in the pipeline, so plenty to read for the European regulations. And then the Americans have been doing this since the 1970s and publishing guidance documents. So there's a whole heap of information you can read on the FDA website. Next, we need to determine whether the product is a medical device or an IVD. And in general, the technology that touches or analyzes directly the human is a medical device, and those that analyze cells and fluids taken from the body would be IVDs. So on here, we've got a little quiz. So I'm going to ask you to mentally consider whether the pictures are medical devices or IVDs. So I'll start with the left-hand picture. It's for a diabetes monitor, and it's touching a blood drop and then sucking up a bit of blood for a diagnostic test probably for blood sugar. So although it catches out a few people because it touches the patient, it is correctly assessed as an IVD. It's an in vitro diagnostic. In vitro means outside the body, and it's a diagnostic. The next picture is a continuous glucose monitor, and if used for a medical application, and it doesn't need to be, it would be considered an IVD or a medical device or general equipment. It is in fact a medical device because its main function is to be attached to the patient, and it actually has microneedles inserted through the patient's skin at all times. So because it touches the patient, it's a medical device, even though it's doing the same thing as the first picture. Its primary intended function determines whether it's a medical device or an IVD. The next picture is vacuum tubes or blood tubes. So these look like test tubes, and you would be forgiven for thinking they were general lab equipment, but they are in fact IVDs, and they are classified under the new regulation as a sample receptacle, and they are Class A devices. They hold blood in a usually plastic vessel for a period of time, and they are IVDs. Blood bags do the same. So they hold blood for a period of time in a plastic container until it's needed, but the indications for use, the intended use, is for that blood to go into a human, and therefore it makes them a medical device. And there is a classification rule specifically designed around blood bags. And then we get on to software. So software can be all three things. So it could be an IVD, could be a medical device, could be a non-medical device software. Here we've got two pictures, both containing software, or both being analyzed by software. The first one is a biopsy slide, and the slide is a slide that's taken from the body, and it's tested and analyzed within a laboratory. And for that reason, if we analyze that slide, the software is IVD software. Underneath, we've got a mammography scan, and the software on the scan is being used to determine whether that lady has cancer or not. It's almost exactly the same as the scan above, and yet it's medical device software. And generally, most software is medical device software, but it is nuanced in the European Union and the UK. And that takes us to the classification rules. Now that we know we've got a medical device, what do we do about it? Well, what we do about it is then driven by the classification. So we have to understand the classification. So on the screen, we've got classification levels for medical devices, IVDs, and American classification. I'm going to go through all of it, but I'll start with the European situation. So anything that's already on the market and hasn't transitioned to the regulation yet under CE law can fall under the medical device directives. Any new product being placed on the market in the UK follows the Medical Device Directive 9342 EEC. You would use Annex 9 to find 18 rules, and you just start at Rule 1 and you work your way through to Rule 18, and somewhere in there is your classification. You do the same in Europe, but you use Annex 8 in the European MDR, and there's an extra rule for Class 1 reusable, or not a rule, but a classification level, Class 1 reusable. Something like a scalpel blade, which is sterilized between uses, but used on multiple people, would now be classified as a Class 1 reusable. The only other thing of note is that there are 22 rules. So instead of having 18 rules, there's 22 rules. And one of them is very important for software. But when you look at it, you think, oh, nothing's changed. But in fact, lots have changed. So a lot of Class 2B got moved up to Class 3, and a lot of software was Class 1 previously is now Class 2A or higher, as we will see now. So if you look in the European regulation, you find that in Annex 8, the classification rules are broadly split into 4 sections. We've got non-invasive devices, invasive devices, active devices, and then what's known as special rules. So you work your way through. I'm not going to read all of this out, don't worry, but you work your way through from Rule 1 all the way to Rule 22, and somewhere in there will be your classification of your product. So Rule 1 says all non-invasive devices are classified as Class 1 unless one of the other rules set out hereinafter applies. Rule 2 talks about invasive devices intended for channeling or storing of blood for the purpose of infusion. Rule 3 talks about all non-invasive devices intended for modification of biological or chemical compositions of human tissues. The Rule 4 talks about non-invasive devices that come into contact with the injured skin, like a plaster or a bandage, might fall into Rule 4 because they're all non-invasive. Move on to the invasive rules, Rules 5 to 8. Body orifices that are looked through to get a patient diagnosed would fall into Rule 5. Surgically invasive devices intended for transient use is Rule 6. Short-term use is Rule 7, and long-term surgically invasive devices under Rule 8. And on the left-hand side, I've got the timescale needed for that. So less than 60 minutes is transient, and 60 minutes to a month is short term. Anything longer than a month is long term. And if you look on the right hand side, you'll see that the classification starts off mostly class 1 and 2A, and then mostly class 3 as you go down. The longer the implant is inside you, the higher the risk to the patient. Rules 9 to 13 talk about the active device rules. An active device is anything that is powered not by gravity and not by movement of the human body, but by something else like electricity. And every electrically powered medical device is an active device, and it fits into one of these rules. Active therapeutic devices intended to administer or exchange energy would be classified as 2A unless other things applied. Active devices intended for diagnosis and monitoring are classified under Rule 10, mostly as class 2A. Rule 11 is where software comes in, and it's a new rule within the regulation. It wasn't there under the directive. Software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is automatically classed as a class 2A. So that one line catches nearly all software. And previously to this, it was a lot easier to avoid classification to a 2A device. But now nearly everything is a 2A device. Rule 12 talks about active devices intended to administer or remove medicinal products, and Rule 13 is all other active devices are class 1. Then we get the special rules, those to do with devices incorporating medicinal products, contraception or conception or preventing transmittal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, devices intended for disinfecting, cleaning, rinsing, hydrating, contact lenses. Rule 17 is about diagnostic images generated by X-ray. Rule 18 is about devices manufactured utilizing tissues or cells of human or animal origin or their derivatives. Rule 19 talks about devices incorporating or consisting of nanomaterials. Rule 20 talks about invasive devices with respect to body orifices intended to administer medicinal products by inhalation. So a asthma inhaler is covered by Rule 20. Rule 21, devices that are composed of substances or combinations of substances intended to be introduced into the human body via a body orifice or applied to the skin and are absorbed by or locally dispersed in the human body. And then lastly, Rule 22, active therapeutic devices such as closed loop systems or automatic external defibrillators. That's all the rules. And what you find is that quite often more than one of those rules apply. And if that's the case, then generally speaking, you find the highest classification, and that sets a classification for your product, excluding software. So in Annex 8, it says that software within the device is classified by the classification of that device. So if you had the rare exception of having a device that was class 2A and a software being class 2B, my understanding is that the software would be classified under the remit of the whole product as a class 2A. So it's usually driven by the highest risk, except for software where it's driven by the device as a whole. Now this slide here is about the UK and the European situation. So in the UK, we are following the old Medical Device Directive 93/42 EEC. And under Rule 10, it said, amongst other things, it said active devices intended for diagnosis are in class 2A. Now, for years, industry has been saying, oh, actually, we don't do the diagnosis. Oh, no, we leave that to the clinician. We just provide the information. And so therefore, we're a class 1 under Rule 12. And for the majority of times, that was the correct approach, because there's a swerve, because it does specifically say diagnosis. Under the regulation, it now says under Rule 10, active devices intended for diagnosis and monitoring are classified as 2A. So if you're not doing diagnosis, what else are you doing? You're probably monitoring with your software. So therefore, it will catch you. And then in addition, you've got this additional classification rule, which the first line captures 99% of all software. And then there's a lot of other rules within there. And you could get to a situation where you could be a class 1 in the UK under Rule 12, And then rule 11 for CE marking purposes, if you went to Europe with the product, you might even be a class 3 device. So you need to be very careful about where you're selling the software. And just as a heads up, if you say, oh, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some software, I'm going to put it on the cloud, the Amazon cloud, that will cover the whole of the UK, and I'm completely safe. What about Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland has to follow the European rules. So it's the whole of the UK except Northern Ireland, which has to follow CE marking or NI marking, Northern Ireland marking. So there's a lot to it if you've got software. One question that comes up all the time is, where can we stretch the boundary in terms of diagnosis? So the previous slide says that if your product did diagnosis, you're a class 2A in the UK. So, okay, my product doesn't do diagnosis. I say my product doesn't do diagnosis, and therefore I can get a UKCA mark class 1. Well, very recently I've discovered on the MHRA website, not to do with specifically all software, but I think it would apply to all software. I found this definition of what the MHRA would consider diagnosis, and I think it's the best information I've got that I can lead people to. So if the software helps to determine initial or indicative working or full diagnosis, then it would be seen as diagnostic. Enable self-assessment symptom checker. The software could be a risk assessor looking at profiles, triages, and screening. The software might provide health information, measures, calculates, or scores, or clinical decision support, or it might do prediction, estimation, or provides a prognosis. And the one that keeps coming up sometimes on a daily basis for me is clinical decision support. So in this X-ray, we're looking at pneumonia. What's the chances of this individual having pneumonia? Well, you could create some software and do a percentage, an algorithm that looks at the percentage of white mass where there should be black mass, and come up with a score. And you could say, well, oh, the software just gives an indication, and it's up to the clinician to administer antibiotics and take the additional steps needed for that individual. But you're actually putting a clinical decision support on the screen by having the 5% and 40% in this example. So just be very careful if you're basically, I suppose the message is not whether the device does diagnosis, it's whether there is a diagnostic function within the device, I suppose is the simplest way of saying it. So that covers medical devices. We then can think about IVDs. So under the directive 9879 EC, we look at Annex 2, and there is list A and list B, and then everything else apart from self-testing IVDs would go under a general classification. And under the directive, it was estimated that 80% of all IVDs were self-declared on the market. Under the regulation, IVDs are classified as A, B, C, D, and for them, 90% of all IVDs need a notified body to look at the technical file as part of their submission process. So this is what it says in list A and B in Annex 2. It's not an abbreviation, this is just a copy and paste of the text. The most common, I would say, the most common IVD that I'm seeing on a weekly basis at the moment is IVDs for cancer detection. And I think the only cancer detection on this list is here, determination of the following marker, tumor marker, PSA. And there's lots of other tumor markers now that's not PSA. Therefore, you can self-declare those on the UK market. So there is this loophole for software and IVDs, which is being closed. So as soon as the regulation comes out, that will be closed, and expect the regulations to be at least as stringent as they are in Europe. So if you've got a product, and if you can get to market before the new regulation comes out, then you've got yourself a head start, and there will be a transition period, and you'll have some time to get all the ducks in a row. The date of application of the UK MDR was originally July the 1st, 2024. Then it went to 2025, and now it's been postponed until 2026. I don't know when in 2026 because I can't see the information on the MHRA website. It could be in January, it could be in December. I don't know at this stage, but hopefully we'll get told soon enough by the MHRA and we can start planning our lives. This is the regulatory strategy for Europe. So if you want to get your product CE marked, or if you're thinking about the future in the UK, the future in the UK will probably not follow ABC, but it's likely that I think it'll follow 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, but 4 would be equivalent to a D, and you can probably work the rest out yourself. So you start off with rule 1, and you say, am I doing blood screening or am I looking at high risk disease? No. Okay. Am I doing a blood or tissue compatibility test? Could it be high blood group, a high risk blood group? Okay. No. Okay. Then rule 3, infectious disease, cancer testing, companion diagnostics, drug monitoring, congenital screening, all these things would be a class C. And the majority of my people I interact with on a Wednesday and for clients, they're a class C IVD. The only thing that's not regulated so strongly and don't need notified body for is class A. And you've got there this specimen receptacles like those blood tubes that we saw earlier. When we look across the pond at America, we've got class 1, 2, and 3. And they're all fundamentally different. And the way you work a classification out in America is you look to see what's already on the market and you say, well, that's a class 3 or a class 2, and I'm the same as that, therefore that's how I'm going to classify. You have that conversation with the FDA and hopefully they agree with you, and then they'll look at your technical file as appropriate. You can self-declare, which means they don't look at your technical file for a class 1, just like in Europe and the UK. If you're a class 2, then you're most likely to go through a 510K. If you're a class 3, you're most likely to do a PMA. But I'm working with a company who in the UK would be a class 2A medical device, I think. In America, because of the regulatory framework, they're classified as a class 3, but they're using a 510K to do that with the FDA. So there's lots of nuance when you go to America, and you really should work with an American expert for that strategy. If there's never been a product like yours in the market in America, you have to go through what's called a de novo, it would be the absence of a predicate device, and usually a 510K is used because there is a predicate device on the market in America. So that's the classification in the UK and Europe and America. But remember that the world is a big place, so we need to consider all aspects of regulatory framework for the world. If you've got any questions on how would you classify the device and what other things to get involved with, there's a couple of places I could send you to. Obviously, speak to me. There's my website, my business card again. Metrics is a new company. They were a spin out from Oxford Innovations. They used to do this for free. Now they charge for it. But what they're trying to do is link up with universities, and universities will then pay for a license, and then you can tap into that resource as a startup or as an academic. And they will tell you about the device classification, the essential requirements, which is a function of something you need to do within your technical file. And they'll also advise you what ISO standards you need to meet the requirements of. If you've still got questions, you can contact the MHRA directly on devices.borderlines. And if you've got any questions about FDA applications, then you can contact DICE at FDA. And usually within the borderlines one in the UK, you'll get an answer within a month. And within America, you should get it within 24 hours. So just bear in mind you need a bit of patience with the UK, but they are very good when they come back. It's good. It's a good, well thought through decision. So I am maybe 4 minutes early, not badly timed. Annie, I don't know if there's any questions come through so far, but I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. So we've had one question, which is probably for me, about timescales. So what timescales do you require if someone needs help with grant applications? So some of the NIHR calls have only had 4 weeks from announcement to deadline. So we would normally ask for 8 weeks minimum to support a grant application, but it does very much depend on what you're asking of us. So, you know, asking for some input into a study that's already designed, or some PPIE or some data analysis is a lot different to asking for a full clinical study and developing that and designing protocols. So I think, please engage with us. The earlier you can engage, the better. There doesn't need to be a call out at that time. If you've got something that you want collaborating on, then please do contact us and we can start to develop that. And then when a call comes along, we can hopefully apply. We have had some other questions, Richard,
Okay.
that people submitted when they signed up for the webinar. So there's a question around, do medical device studies follow the same phases as pharma CTIMP studies?
Well, the simple answer is I don't know, because I'm not a pharma expert, but what I can tell you is the studies tend to report back to the classification. So if it's a class 1 device, you might just need some usability testing and then you're on the market. If it's a class 3 device, you'll need stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 clinical study, just like a medicine. Stage 1 is usually done in my world in TRL 6, which is all about safety testing before you get a clinical test done in TRL 7, so a clinical trial where you do stage 2 and stage 3. So there is some similarity, but I'm no expert on pharmaceuticals. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that they're not the same. So I think in pharma studies, it's very strictly phased, whereas as you said, in medical device studies, those studies are usually smaller and they're usually to meet the needs, what is required essentially. So yeah, there's usually a small kind of feasibility study and followed by, an early clinical investigation, and then that kind of scales up to generate the evidence that they need. There's another question about kind of what to consider if you're in the new product development stage. Like, what are the first things that you should consider?
Okay, well, that will be on my next presentation this afternoon, but it's essentially the design inputs. So if you're a new startup, whether you're making shoes or a medical device, the first thing you should do is work out what the customer actually wants. So without that, you can't design the correct product. So within the medical device industry, that should be documented. So document the user needs, document the design requirements or software requirements, document the hazards associated with that and do a risk assessment. And then once you know what the hazards are associated with your medical device, you can design those hazards out by creating a safe medical device. And that's when you should start the medical device design process. Once you've aligned those items, and you've got the design inputs and the hazards all on a spreadsheet, you can then add verification and validation, and that's a traceability matrix where it basically will tell you what verification and validation you need to do in order to prove your product is safe and effective. And so that piece of work is really important, and that's probably the first thing you should do. The very first thing is talk to lots of clinicians and users of the device, or intended users. Talk to manufacturers, so you don't go down the same route that I went down early in my career, where we had a great idea, but it was very difficult for our suppliers to manufacture it. So I'll just, as an indication of how difficult it was, if you imagine a plastic part that big, I used to measure that 11,000 times with 3D measuring, automated measuring device. So 11,000 times, 4 of those per batch, plus literally hundreds of other devices tested for every batch of raw material we had in. And the only reason we were doing that was because it was so hard for our manufacturer to make the device. So please talk to the manufacturers, talk to the clinicians, talk to the patients, work out what you want. You might want a device with lots of buttons on it, or one button. You might want a screen, you might not want a screen. And what you have in your brain as to what's important may not be what the majority of clinicians want. So talk to as many as you can. Once you've done that, then document the design inputs, and that's how I start every project.
Yeah, and that's where we can help as well.
Very good.
Okay, we'll have one more question before the break. So we've had a question about software. So you might have already answered this question. So software changes regularly and code lists, for example, risk prediction, change all the time. For Class 2A, what is required for MHRA re-approval?
Not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll
So
give it.
does that mean if something's already been approved and then the regulations are changing, or the codes, maybe the code within the software has changed, what do they need to do?
One of my very last slides on this, the next session, is about software and the importance of 3 decimal place version control. So rather than having version 25, you might have version 0.1.7 or something. So if you're on the market and the notified body's already given you a CE mark, and you get some customer feedback or a complaint that says, oh, there's something wrong with the product, it might be a patch that you put onto the software to keep it in line and keep it working as intended, and as the notified body or the FDA giving you permission to be on the market in the first place. They don't want to know about changes you make to keep it on the market if all you're doing is repairing it. So that's the 3rd decimal place. So you put updates to those to the 3rd decimal place. The middle decimal place will be things like large scale updates of the software, or things like usability engineering, changing of the device. And some of that will need to be reported to the MHR, to the notified body. Some of it won't need to be reported. And so we need a way of controlling that within the quality management system. And then the 1st decimal place will be things like the indications of use. So if you've got it for Parkinson's disease in one of my examples, and you said, oh, we can use this for knee surgery as well, that's a change of indicated to use, and that would need to go through the notified bodies, and you'd have to demonstrate evidence for that. So part of the answer is establishing a 3 decimal place version control, which is very typical, but not everyone's following it, but it's very typical. That will give you a massive advantage when you're on the market. And then in terms of how much evidence you need to show, is you need to show enough evidence. So if you're I had 3 calls this morning, and one of them was about a software to do with brain surgery. I'm imagining you'd need to have more evidence for application that impacts brain surgery than you would if you had a much simpler Class 1 or a Class 2A software device. So yeah, it depends, I would say. Hopefully that's answered the question enough. Very happy to have a more directed conversation over Zoom at some point.
Thanks, Richard. So we're pretty much bang on time, which is great. So if we'll have a 10-minute break now, and then we'll reconvene at 2:30.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Annie.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back, everybody. So yeah, welcome back to our HealthTech regulatory webinar. So in this second session, which runs from 2:30 to 3:15, Richard will be talking about design, control and technology readiness levels, and then quality management systems. And again, we'll have a Q&A until 3:30 after this session. So please do put your questions in the Q&A section. Richard, I'll hand back over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Annie. It's so nice outside. I nearly didn't come back. Hopefully there's enough people come back to make it worthwhile.
Hopefully everyone's got a nice cup of tea or coffee to...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've got a nice cup of tea, but it's lovely outside. So hopefully now, when I share, you should be able to see the toads again, wave their arms about, and then can you see now the fundamentals page? Great. Yeah. So we've covered regulations. The next bit I want to talk about is design control and the quality management system. And then the two things really come together, but let's start with design control. So first of all, the key learning objectives for this training is what are the requirements for design control in 13485 and the US FDA requirements? What's the typical structure and the contents of a technical file? What is a typical development roadmap, TRLs? And we can debate whether mine or Annie's is correct, but we'll just go from there. And then we've got what can you do right now to ensure regulatory compliance? So as the hint there is, you'll need to introduce some quality management system. So I'm not going to talk about ISO 13485 in great detail and quality management system document requirements in great detail, but there are certain things you can do right now that will mean that you have a much easier journey going through. So first of all, fundamentally, what's ISO 13485? It might be something you've heard people talk about, but not fully understood what it was. So it's an ISO standard, which means it is state of the art, and it means that you have to meet the requirements of ISO 13485 before you place the product on the market. Annie, I've just seen a thing that says recording has stopped. Is that something I should worry about?
Emma, can you check the recording, please?
Yeah, it's still saying recording for me.
Okay, I'll carry on regardless.
I think it's okay. Yeah, don't worry.
So 13485 is a required standard, and it's something you can become certified to. So if you read the old directive for Europe, so what we're following in the UK now, it talks about a management system, and the new regulation talks about a quality management system. And it also says in those regulations that your product must be state of the art. And state of the art means that you must meet the relevant ISO standards or IEC standards. So by default, even though 13485 is not documented within the regulations, you have to meet the requirements of it. And if you choose to, then you can become certified to it. And the majority of people eventually become certified to it. It's either because they can't get CE marking without it, or it's because they'd end up with no customers. So the NHS, if you go through procurement, the NHS require companies to be 13485 that supply services and products to the NHS. If your objective is to create an app that is downloaded onto a clinician's phone, then being ISO 13485 certified is a bit meaningless because the clinician doesn't know what 13485 is. So you have to kind of understand that not every company is going to have it, but the vast majority do. In Europe now, under the new regulation, as part of gaining CE mark, it's mandated that your quality management system is third-party assessed by a notified body, just like it would be during 13485 audit. So it'd be madness not to get certified at the same time. So the majority of companies are certified. Now, when you look inside the standard, you find there are 8 clauses, and the first 3 can be ignored largely. And then you see the 4 clauses that are on the screen in front of you. And it's product realization that I want to talk about now. So in the US, we've got the Food and Drug Administration, Part 21 CFR Part 820. And 820 was a literal copy and paste from 1997 version of 13485. And the Americans are bringing out a new QMSR, and it's already been launched for review and as a live version, but not mandated. And as of January next year, it'll be mandated in America. It is again a carbon copy of the requirements of 13485, and there's very little difference between the requirements in America and the ISO standard. And ISO, by the way, means International Standards Organization. So everywhere in the world is covered by the requirements of ISO. So 13485 and CFR Part 820 are allegedly the same thing. And I'll show you what that means now. So if we were to look inside the medical device ISO Quality Management System 13485, you'll see that Section 7 is about product realization, and particularly 7.3 talks about design and development. If you look inside the American regulation, you'll see that it's almost exactly the same. Their Section 3 includes the same information. So the quality management system must ensure that the product is developed within an environment that allows development and planning. Your design inputs and your design outputs have to be documented. You must do design review. You must do verification and validation of the design, and those design outputs have to be linked to your design inputs. You must have documented design and development transfer, and that includes software. You must do design and development changes. They must be controlled through the development process and afterwards once you're on the market. And design and development files are needed. Now, 13485 calls them design development files. The Americans call them design history files. I call them technical files. Everybody has a name for them, but it means the output of the processes above, basically. So you've got an ISO standard which says you must do design development and you must make a technical file. What goes into a technical file is a question. So if you look in Annex 2 of either the medical device regulation or the in vitro medical device regulation in Europe, it now tells you. So Annex 2 has a description of what's needed in a medical device technical file, and it says you must have 6 folders within your technical file. So device description and specification, information supplied by the manufacturer, that's things like the instructions for use. Design and manufacturing information is information that tell the reader of the technical file who designed and manufactured the device and what were the processes. You need a document which is called the General Safety and Performance Requirements Checklist, and that's defined by Section 4. And then you must do a risk assessment and apply full risk management according to the regulation. And then you must do verification and validation. And if you look at on the right-hand side, this is an example of my technical file template, and the majority of it is covered by documents which are in Section 6. The contents of a technical file are covered all on one page here. So whether you're a medical device or an IVD, this is basically the output from that previous page in terms of verification and validation. So you get rules and regulations given to you by the regulations and also the standards, and they impact the journey all the way along. The journey starts at the top and goes all the way down to the bottom. So usability engineering starts round about when you're documenting the user needs, documenting the design inputs or the software requirements. You must have a usability engineering project plan and a use specification for the product. So that's who's using the device under what conditions of use, for what purpose. That needs to be defined. You must do some form of clinical evaluation for medical devices or scientific validity report for an IVD. Now, a clinical evaluation report is a combination of both the clinical investigation for medical devices and a literature study, whereas the scientific validity report is just a literature study. But they both have to be done. I gave you the MedDev for the CER in the previous slide. I'm trying to remember now, 2.7/1 revision 4, I think it is. Functional performance report or analytical performance report, they call it for IVDs. That's laboratory testing. So whether the device works under perfect conditions using standards and statistical techniques and laboratory techniques, that's covered in the middle. And then whether it works or not in the lab is kind of irrelevant if it doesn't work in practice. So a clinical investigation is needed for medical devices, and a clinical performance is needed for IVDs. Along this journey, you must create a risk management plan, do a risk assessment that's impacted all the way down, and then create a risk management report. And it's the output of the usability engineering report, the clinical investigation report and everything above, and the risk management report that goes into the performance evaluation report that summarizes everything and supports your product claims. So if you say that you've got an accuracy of 99.7% with your medical device, then that's supported by the evidence that's above. And then you have to go through registration. So for a class 1 device, you self-declare and then launch. For anything more, you need to notify body in the UK and Europe, and you need to register with them, and they allow you to place a product on the market when you've proven that the product is safe and effective. When you're on the market, you need to do post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up and apply design control for any changes that you might make. You'll notice that the changes go through risk management before they go back into verification and validation. So if you've got a product and there's a customer complaint and you need to redesign it, you've got to consider all the hazards that are identified in the first instance as part of your risk management before you validate the new design and put it on the market, because you might miss something. You might make it more unsafe rather than safer. There are also technical file requirements given to you by the regulations and the standards. So each one of the standards might have requirements for the company. So not only is there going to be input into the technical file given to you by that Annex 2 of the regulation, but also it'll say you have to be state of the art. So if you're an electrical device, you'll need to meet the requirements of ISO standards and things that of that nature that you can be tested against. The roadmap, the TRL roadmap, technology readiness level. Now, what's not on here is TRL 0. So if you're an academic and you're developing a technology, or you have a technology, you might have been designing that or creating that for the last 10 years. And at some point, there's a spark of inspiration or a clinical need suddenly arises because of other technology, and a project is started. So you launch the device at TRL 1, launch the project at TRL 1, and at TRL 2, this is the part that nobody does very well, to be honest. Most people rush straight into TRL 4 if they're really bad, but TRL 3 if they're a little bit better. Most people miss this out. In TRL 2, what you should be doing is talking to all the clinicians, patients, manufacturers, anyone that's going to impact the performance of your device and what the user requires and what the user need is. All of that needs to be understood fully before you move to TRL 3. And then in TRL 3, you start by documenting the user needs, the design inputs or software requirements, and then do a risk assessment. Once you know what the hazards are, you can then start designing it. Now, there'll be some designing work done in TRL 3, which is very rough and ready. And TRL 4 is much more like, okay, of all the 5 things we tried, one of them worked really well, and we're going to use that in TRL 4. And you would do that for all different aspects of the project until everything was in TRL 4, and you would build different models, create different ideas. In TRL 4, you would do some clinical performance studies. You might do, you do laboratory testing, but you would do some usability engineering. That might be usability testing. It might be full-blown clinical studies with a very weak product, effectively. In order for all of that to work and be successful, you need some controls. So we need to document the design inputs and the risk assessment. That goes into the technical file. We'll need some documentation to tell us what to do. And I would say the documentation starts at the boundary between TRL3 and TRL4. So how would you go about documenting the traceability of the product? Well, that should be defined in your quality management system. And then all your experiments in the lab would be using equipment, and the equipment should be documented, and that documentation of the equipment is defined by the quality management system. And then as the project continues, you build up more and more requirements and more restriction within the quality management system to the point where you're on the market. Now, I've mentioned 13485. It's something you can become certified to, and I would probably recommend in most situations, especially if the product is, well, only if the product has been spun out of the university or is in a limited company, you would gain ISO 13485. 13485 wraps around the company, and if you produce 20 products in that company, all of those 20 products are captured within the ISO certification. You can get ISO 13485 at any point. You can even do it when you're on the market. It's not a legal requirement to become certified. It's a legal requirement that you follow the standard. But the earlier you get certified, the more robust your processes will be naturally, because people are people and they follow. If they know that someone's going to come in and ask them questions and it's going to be embarrassing if they haven't done stuff correctly now, they're more likely to do it correctly now than if they know that no one's going to check up and look at them. How would you scale the product? So for a physical product, you could generate a product through TRLs 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and then exit the company with a prototype. Oh, I didn't actually finish what I was going to say. Sorry about that. On this here, we've got, once you've gone from lab testing, you can move into a much more structured manufacturing validation for physical products or software validation for software. And then during that process, you qualify all the suppliers, you validate all the equipment and all the processes. And by the time you've got to the end of TRL5, the product is manufactured in a way that's really consistent. And if you make one product, it's identical to 100 products you would make. By the time you got to the end of TRL4, in my world, you would end up with a product which always worked, but you might only have half a dozen of them, and you certainly couldn't scale. So you might need some investment to get to TRL5, and that's why, as I mentioned on that other slide, it might be a good time to spin out. TRL6 is where you would check the safety of the product. So this is where you might do phase 1 clinical assessment for a class 3. You might check electrical safety, sterility, data security for anything connected to the internet. And that's all done on stuff that you've manufactured in your validated processes. And then you do clinical performance testing in TRL7 on stuff you're about to place on the market. And generally speaking, in TRL5, you might make more than you need, and that stuff goes onto the market in the future. So you're testing to make sure it's okay. You would then gain regulatory approval, whether it's self-declaration or you need a notified body. You then launch, having prepared for post-market surveillance, and then when you're on the market, there's no surprises. Any customer complaints come straight through to you. You make design changes in a controlled manner, and if you need to, you can re-contact the notified body to ensure the CE mark is still valid. It's not to say that you're not doing clinical testing in TRL4. You are, but the testing you're doing is not a robust product. And then before you place the product on the market, you really make sure it's robust before you gain regulatory approval. So with all of that in mind, if you're a physical product, how would you, if you're creating a company, how would you make money from this venture? Well, you could sell the product, the license of to make the product to the highest bidder, and you would do that typically at TRL4. So you've proven the product functions really well, and that there's real legs to the industry, to the product, and somebody would then pay a lot of money for it. You could go a step further, and even using jigs and fixtures that you're creating in TRL4, you could use that to make some small batches that you take all the way through to gain CE mark or UKCA or FDA approval, and then exit and sell to the highest bidder. Equally, you could exit having built a factory. So there's multiple different places you could exit the process, and the further you go, the more value the company's worth, but the more investment you need and possibly dilution of your investment. If you're making software, then the rules change a little bit. Generally speaking, it's much easier to make software than a physical product. The process is quicker and less costly. And generally speaking, exit always happens at TRL 10. Not always, but quite often. When you're at TRL 10, to get there, you can either create software ad hoc to the end of TRL 4, and then in TRL 5, rewrite the software according to the IEC 62304 standard, and then continue by doing safety testing for interference and cybersecurity, and then do a clinical performance study with the new software to gain CE mark. Or you can generate software in the full knowledge and presence of 62304 and make 62304 software all the way along. By the time you get to the end of TRL 4, you don't need to do TRL 5, 6, and 7 then, because you've done everything already. And then you go straight to TRL 8. Now, which approach you take is largely built on who's building the software. I would say probably 9 times out of 10, it's ad hoc generated software, and at some point someone goes, all right, we better do this properly, and then they make validated software to 62304, and they have to go through the validation process again. I'm not here to say which one's quicker. It might be quicker to do that, but there are 2 approaches, and I wanted to highlight that. No matter which way you go, please ensure that traceability is controlled all the way through. It's super important. If you're doing a clinical study in TRL 4 and that's on version 25, and you go to versions 26 at launch, what's changed? Well, it's going to be challenging for you to document exactly what's changed, because lots of things might have changed to go from one version to another. If it's 25 to 26, you might be on version 35. But if you're using 3 decimal places, you can be much more prescriptive with these changes, so that let's say you're at the end of TRL 4 and you recognize there was some performance improvements you could make to the software, but largely the usability doesn't change. The user interface remains the same, and it's just the stuff that happens behind. You would put all of that into the 2nd decimal place, and you would record that during the development progress, and then that would support your CE mark, even though you might be on version, say 0.5.6 is here, you might be on version 0.7 when you're at CE. But as long as you can demonstrate what has changed, you might be able to use the evidence you gained at TRL 4. Now, when we're looking at clinical evidence, it's important to understand the ethical approach. So it's obviously better to make something in a factory on a validated line or validated software, having tested it for safety before you do clinical performance studies. But the reality is you might be doing very small mocked up proof of concept models and using those in a clinical setting, depending on the circumstances. And the only way that that's safe is to use ethical approval. And sometimes you go to a clinical environment, like a hospital, and you say, can I do my study here? And they say, oh, we only let CE mark devices in here to do clinical studies. I hear that all the time. And the important thing to push back with is, well, I can't get a CE mark until I've proven that it's clinically safe. And that's how every product is CE marked. It's CE marked based on the clinical evidence. And how you overcome that is through evidence. So what you need to do is follow proper design control and do a risk assessment, both for the product and the process of the clinical study. And it's that evidence you're going to give to the MHRA for them to give you a letter of no objection. And that's how you're going to gain access to those tricky situations. Ethical approval might not be necessary if you use healthy volunteers. So if you use friends and family, that might be completely acceptable for the type of medical device. And you get a lot of usability data back from healthy volunteers. You might use resources that are not in the NHS, or you might do oversee research, all of which would not require ethical approval. But remember, never assume that ethical approval is not needed. And most colleges and universities have their own ethical committee. So quite often they will require, just for their own insurance purposes, they'll require ethical approval. And when you work with anything to do with the NHS, you need ethical approval. So whether it's their equipment, their people, their patients, then you need ethical approval for doing work with the NHS. So what immediate actions can you do in order to satisfy future requirements? So if you look at 13485 all the way through, it says the organisation shall document procedures, and then it goes on to talk about something, in this case for design and development at section 7.3.1. It says the organisation shall document procedures for things 33 times. These are all the clause numbers where that is stated in the standard. And you might be looking at this thing thinking, okay, we need an actual documented procedure for this. That's a job in itself. That is a quality management system, and that is a job in itself. And it's a requirement of all the regulations. However, this is at launch. So if you're just starting off and you've got the basic products, there's only there's a handful of documents which you need and should be having within your quality management system. So traceability, things like lot numbers and part numbers of materials you use and things you create, very important. Version control for software, very important. Product identification. So if you have 3 batches of raw material and one of them doesn't work very well, if you don't know which lot number that was, then you can't use that as evidence to know what is good and what's bad. So product identification becomes very important. Control of design and development changes is important. You must have a documented procedure for design review. How do you do design review? What's included in design review? How would you go about that process? It should be within your design and development procedures. You must do risk management. So why not have a procedure that tells you what to do so that you can meet all the requirements? There are other ones like purchasing controls. Maybe at this stage you might have a good relationship with some suppliers and you might want to have quality agreements in place with them quite early on. Always control records. At the FDA say if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So if you can't find a record for it within 10 minutes, according to the FDA, the evidence doesn't exist and you didn't do it. So always ensure that you have a very good control of records through the whole of the development process. So there's not a huge amount you need to think about, but some very valuable stuff. And then as the development progresses through TRLs 4, 5, 6, and 7, add more and more of the requirements from the standard. And then before launch, there are things you'll need about customer complaint handling and feedback processes, which if you don't have, you won't get ISO 13485, and you might find you don't have a customer because the NHS might require you to be ISO 13485 certified. How is this done in practice? Well, you could train your staff, you could identify all the equipment you use, you could put it on a spreadsheet, you could make sure that the spreadsheet has a trigger for calibration requirements. You know, this pipette that the lady is using here, if that's not calibrated pipette and it's not documented what the pipette was used, then the information that's being written down on the sheets is a bit irrelevant because there's no traceability. So whether was it 10 milliliters or was it 11 milliliters, it was actually dispensed to create an experiment. Material identification, description and status is really important. Just general, easy to understand labeling is needed. Supplier qualifications, you create yourself a approved supplier list, have material specifications for the raw materials, and they could be the supplier's specifications or ones that you create. And towards the end of TRL4, it was a really good idea to start putting in place quality agreements earlier if you can. And these are quite descriptive and cover you for things like no change agreements. If you're getting a material supplied to you in a bottle, you need an agreement with the supplier, ideally, that says they will not change that without telling you in advance. And that's a requirement within the standard. So all of this goes into your quality management system and requirements, and the output of all the technical file stuff goes into your technical file. So what could your technical file look like if it was really simple? Well, it could look like a lab notebook. So here we've got a name of the experiment. So following some kind of project along a Gantt chart or something, got a name of the project in case you're running more than one at once, the name of the individual and the signature creating this this thing, and the date. If you create the date in here, it means that any time in the future when there's an IP decision about who has IP and what company has IP and what company doesn't, if you don't capture the date of an inventive step, then that might mean you don't get the patent in the future. You need to record the equipment that was used and the material lots and that were used. That will cover you for the calibration and the material traceability. There might be other things you create, you document, and then down here, these are explained down here. So the aims, the acceptance criteria, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and recommendations for next work. Just really basic stuff that if you leave it to people to do on their own, they quite often miss some of these steps out. So create a form and make sure it's used religiously within your organization. The thing that gets missed all the time is acceptance criteria. If you say, well, this needs to be 95% accurate before it's a thing, and you get to 94%, you might go, it's probably good enough. Whereas if you've stated it on a document, the recommendations for next actions might encourage you to do a bit more work to get that slight advantage. When we look at software, we need to make sure we've got version control nailed down. So have some documentation around your version control and follow it. And remember that within all regulations, you need to keep important records, those that affect product safety and performance, for the product life plus 5 years. And in Europe, it's plus 10 years. So if you've got a piece of software or a physical product and you've got a risk assessment on it, for example, you should keep that for the product life plus 10 years. Now, if the product has a shelf life and the shelf life is 3 years, that doesn't mean 13 years, because the product life means how long it's in the market. So that might be 20 years. And each batch might have a shelf life of 3 years, but the product is in the market for 10 years, which means you need to keep your records for 30 years. And even when the company goes into is dissolved in the future, then there legally within the regulation needs to be money left aside to keep records for the remaining 10 years. Okay, that's in the regulations. Now, when you consider this for software, it becomes even more challenging. So you could have the same approach where you create a page for software, and this is something which is in my quality management system, and I'll leave it up to the companies I serve whether they use it or not. There might be a really good piece of software like Jira or Bitbucket or GitHub that you use to manage or record software changes and software creation. But if you think back 20 years ago and how you were storing software 20 years ago, it's probably on a floppy disk, and you may not even be able to read it anymore. In 20 years' time, it's probably likely on the cloud, but there might be new inventions because of AI that you can't imagine now, and therefore you have to future-proof this. And if you within GitHub and Bitbucket, you can do a pull request, and you can adapt the form that you say, oh, I'm changing this color from blue to green, or I'm changing the accuracy of this to 10%. You can do that within a form. You can create a form like this within these software packages, so it creates a structure, make sure everything's done. The trouble is that even then, you might not be able to get the data out of GitHub in the future in 20 years' time. Are they still going to be in existence? Yes or no? Don't know. So it might be a case of you get software engineers to do what they're doing normally anyway, but somehow you're able to scrape the data out of Bitbucket into Excel or something to create some kind of log of things. Remember, the FDA require information like this within 10 minutes of being asked within an audit situation. So if the FDA are doing an audit of you in the future, and they say, can I see evidence that you did a clinical study when you did this change, and how did you determine that it was a safe thing to do? You have to have the results within 10 minutes. And if you're scrubbing around in GitHub, I doubt you'll do it. But if you've dragged it into some kind of formal approach, you might have a chance. So there will be a really good solution out there, and everybody will probably be thinking of a different solution, but I'll leave it to you to consider. So we've covered all the things I wanted to talk about. We've talked about whether the product is a medical device or not, and including software, where the boundaries are, the regulators, and whether the product is sold in America or the UK or Europe, who's in charge. We've talked about the standards and the regulations, and we've talked about whether the device is a medical device or an IVD, and then that leads you to the classification. And the classification largely drives the rest of the project, because the higher the risk, the more evidence you need that the product is safe and effective. We then looked at the TRL model, my TRL model, and we said, how does this impact your design development process, and what do you need to do at each stage? We then looked at the requirements of ISO 13485 and said, well, all these things are important, but what do we need to do right now in order to fulfill all the requirements? And a simple form like a lab notebook or something like that basically captures all these things in yellow, or most of them. And I've just got one last plug really before I finish and go over to questions. I donate every Wednesday to Giving Back, but I do have some paid for services. I run a design workshop, which is a 2-day design workshop to capture the user needs, the design requirements, software requirements, and risk management. I have services including technical file documents and quality management systems to support all the way along. But please remember, you can contact me at any time to talk about anything to do with regulations, and most of the time I'll push you into a Wednesday clinic, but if it was an emergency, I would see you more quickly. When I'm helping clients with things, if the things I don't know, and I'm not an expert on clinical evidence, I would say, clinical evidence, I talked to Nicola Wall from Afatori. She's my go-to expert, and so I thought it worth sharing. If there was somebody asking about biocompatibility or toxicology, I would send them to Phil Clay. Still runs a business, but it's handing over to Janine and Rona at Chorley Consulting. And MedTech to Market, I've known Matt Pierce now for 28 years. I used to work with him in Bio-Rad, and I would say half the people in MedTech to Market I've known for 20 years plus, and they're a great bunch of people. If you need new product developed for you as a subcontractor, they're a great team. And then obviously you can speak to me for any kind of regulatory advice and mentoring. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. That was really, really helpful. I think, this is such a ever-changing landscape. It's so complex. It's really hard to keep up with. So it's nice to have, a nice overview of everything and point us in the right direction for what we should be reading and what we should be looking at. I think, from what you've said, I think it's key that we need to understand what the unmet need is, what the intended use of the device is, and then thinking about the medical device classification, and that kind of guides everything else, doesn't it? It guides your regulatory strategy, and it guides your kind of evidence generation strategy. So yeah, really helpful. So I think there's been one question. So if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. So there's a question about risk management. So does that follow any framework like RAG rating, or is that flexible on how you approach it?
It's not flexible, unfortunately, and I've never heard of RAG rating, so I can't talk to that, but I can talk to 14971. So ISO 14971 was the evolution of 14971 really starts in 2007. When it was published as an ISO standard or revised as an ISO standard. And the Europeans said, oh, that's not good enough. We need to be even tighter. So the standard says you can reduce risks as far as possible. And the Europeans said, not good enough. And they produced their own version of the ISO standard in 2012 that said, you must reduce risks completely, as far as you can, not as far as possible. I can't remember what the true phrasing was, but I think in 2008, 2007, they said it's to an acceptable level. And in 2012, the Europeans said as far as possible. So completely reduce risks. Now, there's been a lot of debate around that. And then in 2019, the new version of the standard came out, and that now says as far as possible. To an acceptable level, reduce risk to an acceptable level. And that's been ratified and through the European courts now, and is mandated, is harmonized with the European regulations. So If you want to know how to do risk assessment for a medical device, you just follow one ISO standard now, no matter where you are in the world, and it's ISO 14971. It is I'm not going to swear, but it's quite a hard standard to understand. So you're welcome to contact me for some help on that. It's included within my regulatory clinic because it is so hard to do effectively, but you must do it. What I would say is the way I do it, just as a sort of freebie, is I build a traceability matrix for my clients where we document the user needs, the design inputs or risk requirement, software requirements, and then we document all the hazards to those design requirements, and then we do a risk assessment against that. Now, for a physical product, I've made up categories for functional performance, usability engineering, connecting to other parts, and I've just made it up through my experience. For software, as a medical device, you've got IEC 62304. And if you look at clause 5.2.2, it says, the manufacturer shall consider as appropriate the following requirements. And it lists about 30 requirements. So you can build those into a traceability matrix as line items. And then you can line up your traceability matrix for your design inputs as your user needs, design software requirements, hazards, and do risk assessment, and then verification and validation. So all of it's aligned. The ISO standard 13485 says when you're doing design review at the end, your design outputs have to have met your design inputs. So you need a traceability matrix that links everything together, and that includes the hazard analysis. So it is all linked. It is quite complicated. Read ISO 14971. And then if you still stuck, come and find me, and you probably come and find me because it's quite challenging. I'm happy to talk it through on a Zoom call with you. And if you wanted to, you could purchase a 2-day design workshop. It's up to you.
Thank you. So another question: how can involving patients and public partners support evidence creation for the technical file and regulatory approval more generally?
Can you just repeat that again, please, Annie?
So how can involving patients and the public support evidence creation for the technical file and regulatory approval more generally?
So one question I get asked every week without fail is, how many people do I need to test my device on? Is it 3 people? Is it 300 people? Is it 10 people in 30 hospitals? Do I need to test it in the UK and in America? And for clinical performance studies, I don't really know the answer. So the answer comes down to a statistical approach to the device design. So you need to work out how likely is the device going to malfunction and or be used incorrectly. And the higher that number, the more clinical evidence you need to do. But you can't just pick a number out of the air. You have to do it properly with statistics. And so you need a statistician on the team in order to come up with the right answer. That's when I hand over to someone like Nicola Wall, because she's the expert in clinical studies that I go to say, well, how would you design a clinical study for this? And it's really important because when you get through a 5-year development project and you hand your technical file to the notified body and they say, oh, I don't think there's enough clinical evidence in here, you're then left scrabbling around trying to find an evidence. Maybe take you 6 months, might take you a year to get that evidence together. And when you hand your technical file over, 9 times out of 10, you're running out of money as well. And you need to get to market so you can get some income to generate income for the business. And you might go bust trying to get the clinical evidence in place or need to raise more money and more funding. So it's a really, really important decision point. And that's why I feel important to reflect on, to an expert that can plan that for you. I don't know, Annie can probably help out with all of that as well. Yeah. One thing that I have found that's very helpful is in America, there is either an AMI or AMI ANSI or ANSI AMI documents, which I can put people in touch with. Basically, it's some regulatory guidance document that talks about usability engineering, or in America, they call it human factors engineering. So if you just Google human factors engineering, you'll probably find it. What that's doing is saying that if you test your device with 5 individuals, you're going to find 80% of all usability errors with those 5 people. So what the guidance document tries to encourage you to do is do formative testing and summative testing, which is a requirement of 62366, the usability engineering standard. So do multiple formative tests and then one summative test. The one summative test could be your clinical performance study, and then the formative tests you do before are done with friends and family and in a clinical setting. So multiples of those, 5 people each time, say 5 to 8 people it recommends for formative tests, and 15 to 20 people for a summative test. Hopefully that will give you some kind of steer as to what level of clinical testing you need for your study. And Annie, you can probably spin on that quite a lot, I would have thought.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, within the HRC, we have a PPIE specialist, we have patient partners. So we really encourage innovators, to engage patients and the public as early as possible. If they're going to be using this device or this device will be used on them, then it's important to have their input, because often what's important to them is very different to what's important to a clinician. So I think in terms of design and development, it's really important to get their involvement. Also, like you said, thinking about, how big is your study, how many people do you test? That is kind of a biostats question, which again, we can support with clinical study design. It depends on lots of things, prevalence of the condition you're looking at, where you're testing that device, in what setting. And yeah, usability testing is also something that we can help with. So we've conducted usability testing with different kind of staff groups, patients, public. There might be an element of, talking to different groups of staff, in infection prevention control or informatics departments, wherever that technology might be, and whoever's using it. And that's also something that we can support with as well. Okay, so another question. So if thinking about the kind of new regulations that we're all eagerly anticipating whenever they might actually emerge, do you kind of have any insight or thoughts on what to expect or what to prepare for, or any areas that you think might significantly change or be more stringent?
Yeah, so I try to keep on top of this, but it does change from time to time. For software and IVDs, they used to say we were going to follow, in the UK, would follow the IMDRF classification levels. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now for software, they're saying they'll follow the European classification of class 1, 2A, 2B, 3. For IVDs, they're going to follow 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, which would be parity to A, B, C, D in Europe. So quite aligned. The software one was a problem because if your product was classified as a class 3 in terms of the new UK regulation, class 3 would be like a class 2B and wouldn't be a class 3 in what everyone refers to as a class 3. So it was going to cause some problems, and that's probably why they stopped that. What other things are changing? So the most recent is the MHT, what is it? The digital mental health technology. That is at a slight variance to the European regulation. As I read the regulations, I think it goes slightly beyond. Well, it basically says you can process data and it's not a medical device as long as it's not complex, which isn't what it says in the European regulations, as far as I understand them. So slight nuance there. The regulations, if you look at the MHRA website, I've not done this in the last week or so, but about a month ago, I did a big search, and the only thing I could find was one diagram that said what they were going to do when, and that included the launch of this digital mental health app, regulatory advice. It included new requirements for post-market surveillance, which is aligned now with the European regulations. That all happened as to the timeline, and on the timeline, right at the end, it says regulation will be available or will be enforced from 2026. And it doesn't say January or February or December, it just says 2026. So you've got to assume it's going to be early 2026, but then they've been saying it's coming since 2021, whenever we had Brexit. I would have thought within the year of Brexit, I would have thought, knowing that Brexit was coming, that I had it in place at the beginning of 2021. and it's just never appeared since. So there's lots and lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into, but essentially they are trying to do it. The most recent thing that's a big impact, I would say, is in around about November last year. Well, wind the clock back another 2 years. So in 2023, the UK government said they would accept any product on the market that's CE marked indefinitely. And then the MHRA, about an hour later, said, "Oh, that doesn't include medical devices, just to let you know, everybody." So what they've recently said in November last year, was they are considering CE mark registered products to be allowed on the UK market indefinitely, and there's like a referendum or something. So they're considering it, and whether it's going out to the public vote or not, I'm unsure. But I think it's almost a given that it will be accepted like that in the future, because the UK government was so involved with the regulations in Europe, and therefore, why would it not be okay to have a CE mark device able to be sold in the UK? And it reduces the regulatory burden for the UK. It reduces the cost if you're a European or another country manufacturer wanting to sell in Europe, and now you can in the UK. It makes complete sense. So it's likely that something will happen. So the impact of this for startups is if you're a class 1 software, or if you're an IVD that would be able to be self-declared. So in the UK currently, that's the majority of those two types of devices. Under the regulation, it's going to change, and you'll be a class 2A or a class C, most likely, depending on medical device or IVD. If you can get to market before the new regulation comes out, there will be a transition period for anything that's already on the market, so that things aren't taken off the shelves. This happened in Europe, and the transition period was 7 years for medical devices and 8 years for IVDs. So there's likely to be something in the UK which means this transition period, I'm going to guess 5 years plus. So if you're on the market already with your medical technology, you can remain on the market provided you make no significant changes as a class 1 or self-declared IVD indefinitely, until such time becomes mandated, like 5 years later. And then you would need to go under the new regulation. If, however, you are a class 2A device software now, and you'd be a class 2A or higher in Europe, or you're a IVD that's on list A or list B from Annex 2 of the IVD D, you already need a notified body. You're already going to have to go through the pain of getting regulatory approval. Why not get CE mark? Why get UK CE mark? Because CE marks are recognized around the world and within 27 countries in Europe and in the UK. So why would you get UK CE mark? There are some decisions to be made depending on classification. So I think that's probably enough information on that question.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, we'll wait and see what happens with those regulations. I think I've been to a few meetings as well where they just say 2026 and there's no timeline. So yeah, we'll wait and see. But okay, so I think one last question before we finish. What are kind of the most common challenges or that people come to you with, and what advice would you give people to overcome them, or any key bits of information that you would say?
I think other than how do I get funded for this, which I don't have a good answer for. I'm sure, Annie, you've got lots of more sources of information for funding. Apart from funding, it's what do I need to do? And I've outlaid that in this presentation. So determine it's a medical device, work out its product classification, then follow the various regulations and standards necessary to gain regulatory compliance according to a notified body or self-declared. The simple answer is, when you get to proof of concept, start documenting your user needs, design inputs, risk assessment, create your verification validation master plan, put it into a project plan, and you've covered 80% of what you need to do there, because everything else then falls out of that list. So you start knowing that at some point in the future, against a timeline, you'll need to do some kind of clinical performance, and where does the project design need to be at that point, and how much you need to do. Well, it's probably dependent on your product risk classification. So those steps in the first part of this really covers most of the questions I get asked, I would say, on my Wednesdays.
Thank you. Excellent. So yeah, just to kind of pick up on what you said about funding. So yeah, we often apply for grants with companies, you know, NIHR calls, SBRI, Innovate UK, all of those kind of things, and we can support those grant applications as well. So please do reach out and get in touch with us. So I've just popped there the QR code for the short kind of feedback survey for the webinar. So please, I would encourage everyone to complete that if possible. That would be much appreciated. And yeah, just like to thank Richard for your time today, for helping us to better understand the complexities of health tech regulation, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Bye.
Thanks.